Above the quiet streets of Holmby Hills, where residences are hidden behind tall hedges, stands a house that America knows better than many buildings of national importance. A house that was never just a house. A mansion that became legendary even before the first fireplace was lit. The Playboy Mansion. In the early morning mist, it looks almost harmless. An English manor with gray walls, a slate roof, and a garden where peacocks roam. But as the sun rises higher, the surface changes. The house seems to remember its roles. A media machine, a symbol of freedom and scandal, a laboratory of cultural revolution, a giant stage on which the drama of the American dream and its flip side was played out. The question remains simple and frightening. What happens to a house when its walls become witnesses to an era that no longer resembles its legend? And what happens to a society that for decades has accepted myth as reality? Before American culture turned the Playboy Mansion into a myth, the house had already lived a quiet, restrained life for almost half a century. Built in 1927 by architect Arthur Rawlings, it was part of a fashion that swept Hollywood in the early 20th century. The desire to turn young Los Angeles into a semblance of old Europe. American millionaires of those years craved not just luxury, they needed legitimacy, a sense of connection to a civilization that had survived the centuries. That is why the hills of Beverly and Holmby were built up with copies of English estates, French chateaux, and Italian villas. Originally, the mansion served as the family residence of millionaire Arthur Latham. The house became a symbol of the old Hollywood aristocracy that lived behind the scenes, far from the glitz of the studios. Private literary salons, charity evenings, and quiet dinners were held here. The house existed almost as an anti-Hollywood, a place where wealth had to be hidden and emotions restrained. But everything changed in 1971, when a man whose ideology was diametrically opposed to that of the Rolling Stones era crossed the threshold of the mansion. Hugh Hefner, editor, publicist, media mogul, child of post-war America, torn between the conformism of the 1950s and the cultural rebellions of the 1960s. Hefner was born into a deeply puritanical family, where expressing emotions was considered a weakness and control a virtue. Historians note that his childhood was unusually strict even by the standards of that era. Hefner was not hugged, displays of affection were not encouraged, and silence, discipline, and oppression reigned. It is not surprising that, as an adult, he built more than just a magazine. He created an ideological protest against the culture of oppression in which he himself grew up. Playboy became not a business for him, but a project of self-liberation. By the early 1970s, Hefner was already a national figure. His magazine sold millions of copies. Interviews attracted intellectuals of the caliber of Malcolm X and Stanley Kubrick. And the brand itself became a symbol of a new male identity. Free, successful, urban. But Hefner needed a physical center of power. The magazine, offices, and clubs were all fragments of a system. He wanted to create a space where media culture could live around the clock. The mansion in Holmby Hills was the perfect candidate. The gray stone walls created an illusion of eternity. The spaces were large enough for studio-level events. The landscape allowed the infrastructure to be hidden under the guise of an English garden. It is important to understand that America in 1971 was in a state of cultural turmoil. The Vietnam War was undermining trust in the state. Youth movements were demanding freedom, political, cultural, and personal. Hollywood was looking for new forms of identity. The entertainment industry was entering the television age. Hefner seized the moment. He saw that the old institutions of modernity, churches, schools, patriarchal families, were losing power. The media was taking their place, and he wanted to build a house that would become a temple of a new culture, a cultural revolution in which the camera was more important than the pulpit, and personal branding was stronger than tradition. The Playboy Mansion was supposed to combine the private and the public, the domestic and the media, everyday life and ideology. It was not just a symbol of luxury. It was the architecture of a cultural war, where every stone, every room, every guest room was part of a carefully constructed mythology. Why did Hefner choose this particular house? Because it was a space where he could rewrite his own history. A strict, cold childhood. A home built around freedom. Social isolation as a teenager. A residence that is always crowded. Rejection by the elite. A home where the elite themselves will ask to enter. Psychologists would later call this compensatory architecture. Historians called it a media performance that lasted for decades. And for Hefner, it was a response to an era that often rejected his views. The mansion became his manifesto, and America heard this manifesto louder than the voices of many politicians. When Hugh Hefner first entered the mansion at 10236 Charing Cross Road, he saw more than just a house. He saw the infrastructure of a myth that was yet to be built. But to understand his choice, we must first go back to the 1920s, an era when America was experiencing its own architectural rebellion. In 1927, Los Angeles was a city that desperately wanted to appear ancient. Barely 150 years old, it was trying to root itself in the symbols of the old world. Newspapers wrote about it as a place where architecture was catching up with history. New billionaires, oil tycoons, producers, early Hollywood moguls sought to buy not just houses, but legends in stone. English manors, French chateaux, Italian palazzos. In this way, they created the illusion that their wealth was not accidental, but hereditary. Ledham's mansion was part of this ideological wave. Architect Arthur Rawlings, one of the most sought-after specialists of his generation, worked in the Neo-Tudor style. It was an American attempt to reconstruct England during the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Massive walls, vaulted ceilings, dark wood, Gothic arches, garden mazes, everything that inspired a sense of ancient, indisputable power. This style was not accidental. America in the 1920s was looking for a cultural foundation. The Hollywood elite wanted to appear as the new aristocracy. Mansions became their crowns. The house occupied 5.2 acres of land, a luxury impossible today in downtown Los Angeles. The architecture was designed to divide the world into external and internal, public and private. It was the architecture of power, built on the border between openness and inaccessibility. The gray stone facade resembled the castles of Warwick or Glamis. The windows were narrow and elongated like loopholes in a fortress. The walls were deliberately made thick, not only for aesthetics but also for temperature control, another reference to old Europe. The spaces were planned so that guests would never fully understand the geography of the house. It was not a cozy family home. It was a cultural fortress, built at a time when Hollywood feared for its reputation, its money, its secrets. But when Hefner became the new owner, he saw something in this architectural code that others did not notice. Gothic is not about religion. Gothic is about drama, and drama was Playboy's currency. He deliberately did not rebuild the house in the Art Deco style, even though it was fashionable in the early 1970s. Instead, he did what the billionaires of the Gilded Age did. He incorporated his ideology into the old form. The only difference is that Frick built castles to hide his guilt, while Hefner did so to reinforce his own myth. After purchasing the mansion, Hefner turned the space into a hybrid, private residence, plus studio, plus office, plus club, plus political stage. Each room became a functional element of media production. The large hall was a space for interviews, guest appearances, and ceremonies. The winter garden was a bright area where reports were filmed and meetings with producers were held. The games room was an architectural performance, a demonstration of a new culture of leisure. The garden paths were routes for photos, PR walks, and private conversations. The house became a three-dimensional magazine, a physical Playboy, where articles were replaced by rooms and visual images by architectural details. The walls held history, but now they became decorations. Every stone was part of a media spectacle. And that's when a phenomenon that historians call male brand architecture was born, when a house becomes an extension of ideology. To manage the mansion, Hefner needed an invisible army, but Rowling's architecture anticipated this. The basement, like that of Gilded Age houses, concealed mechanisms, access points, and workrooms. Technical corridors allowed service personnel to move around unnoticed. The kitchen occupied almost the entire north wing, like a restaurant. The security system complemented the medieval character of the house, creating the illusion of a closed citadel. Communications, telephone lines, overhead projectors, equipment were hidden in the walls, like in Paramount Studios. The mansion functioned as an image production studio, where every day the myth of Playboy as the new aristocracy had to be maintained. The garden was not just a garden, it was the architecture of social hierarchy. The grotto is a place for private meetings and negotiations. The lawn is a stage for public events. The forest paths are spaces for isolation and reflection. The animal enclosure is a tribute to the exoticism typical of the mansions of millionaires at the beginning of the century. The architecture of the house shaped the ritual. Each guest passed from the public to the private sphere, and each stage reinforced the host's influence. If we read the architecture of the Playboy Mansion as a text, it says the following: I am creating an alternative model of culture. Here, power belongs not to traditions, but to images. Here, the private and the public are intertwined in such a way that they cannot be separated. And in this house, Hefner really was king. Only his kingdom was not hereditary but media-based. He did not invent a new architecture. He took the old one and turned it into a media symbol that survived the Hollywood era, the rise of television, and the digital revolution. While cameras captured the glamour of the parties and guests moved from the hall to the garden as if participating in a live performance of the era, below, in the corridors rarely visited by outsiders, was the real engine of the mansion, a world without which there would be neither glamour nor legend. The Playboy Mansion was often portrayed as a temple of freedom and celebration, but any utopia requires an underground level, a system that ensures its existence. Historians claim that the mansion was not a luxurious home, but a mini-city that operated 24 hours a day. Like the estates of the Gilded Age, it was supported by dozens of people, whose names rarely appeared in the press, but who created the atmosphere that would later be called Playboy magic. Built in 1927, the house already included hidden infrastructure inspired by English estates of the 16th or 18th centuries. In Britain, the upper classes built houses so that servants could move around unnoticed, providing comfort that seemed natural and self-evident. This model was adopted in America, at Vanderbilt Biltmore, at Hearst Castle, at DuPont Nemours, and later, at the Playboy Mansion. Such a house is always divided into two realities. The upper one, public, glamorous, ostentatious, and the lower one, laborious, hidden, continuous. The Playboy Mansion had separate entrances for staff, long corridors leading from the kitchen to each hall, stairs used only by employees, rooms for storing props, costumes, and dishes, technical rooms filled with the noise of pumps, fans, and refrigeration units. This architecture said, beauty is only possible when labor remains behind the scenes. By the 1970s, the mansion required about 30-40 employees, and that was just the permanent staff. During major events, the number increased to 80-90 people. On a typical working day, the house employed high-level chefs and head chefs who served menus that changed depending on the guests, pastry chefs who created desserts for photo shoots and banquets, gardeners who tended to dozens of species of plants, exotic shrubs and jade trees, pool technicians who maintained a complex system of heating, filtration, and chemical stabilization of the water, electricians who worked almost like a studio crew as the house was constantly being filmed, housekeepers who washed and ironed tons of textiles, dispatchers and coordinators who kept track of event schedules, guest movements, prop deliveries, and journalist visits. Most of these people came from working-class neighborhoods in Los Angeles, Koreatown, East Side, Inglewood, parts of Santa Monica. They worked 10 to 12-hour shifts, often staying longer because the house was alive even at night. Interviews that sometimes leaked to the press described the atmosphere behind the scenes as constant motion. Carts rattled in the basement. The kitchen lights never went out. The utility corridors always smelled of detergents and ozone. Gardeners started work before dawn so that the grass would look perfectly dewy in the morning. All this was done so that guests would see the result, not the work. The Playboy Mansion was both a very Californian and a very American place. This is because its underground structure reflected all the social dynamics of the second half of the 20th century. Below, immigrants, workers, people on hourly wages. Above, the media elite, politicians, artists, billionaires. American society rarely talks about the labor that underlies luxury. But it is in houses like these, Biltmore, Mar-a-Lago, Hearst Castle, Playboy Mansion, this invisibility becomes particularly evident. The party on the first floor relied on leveling parquet floors, polishing glass, constant monitoring of electricity, refrigeration, kilometers of pipes and cables, and round-the-clock logistics. Hefner could write manifestos about freedom, but freedom itself existed in his house only because dozens of people maintained order. Strict order, scheduled down to the minute. The mansion's kitchen was huge, more like a restaurant kitchen than a home kitchen. It had steel tables, industrial stoves, massive refrigerators, a separate cutting area, a separate area for cold appetizers, and its own conveyor belt for serving. Restaurant historians note that the Playboy Mansion kitchen is closer to the professional kitchens of the Beverly Hilton or Bel Air hotel restaurants than to a typical home. The party might start at 9 p.m., but preparations began at 2 p.m. Each dish was served as if it came from a large hotel chain, not a private home. Since Hefner had turned the mansion into a media center, it was equipped with a complex communication system. Direct dial telephone lines, equipped editing rooms, analog servers for storing video material, projectors, hidden infrastructure for broadcasts. Engineers worked through the night, laying new cables and replacing outdated equipment, striving to make the house look like a magical space without any visible technology. One former employee said that early mornings at the mansion were almost monastic. Muffled footsteps, the sound of hoses washing the walkways, the smell of coffee and bleach, sunbeams falling on empty chairs by the pool. While the whole world imagined a party, we saw silence, he said. This was a different Playboy. A world where luxury became routine and myth became schedule. It is important to understand that the invisibility of labor is not a flaw in the system. It is its central principle. Like the palaces of the Gilded Age, the Playboy Mansion functioned thanks to a strict boundary. The upper floor created the illusion, while the lower floor ensured its reality. The work was hard, seasonal, but stable. Many employees worked there for decades. They knew the house better than its owners, knew every crack in the tiles, every noise of the old pipes. And it was they who felt the true scale of the mansion most keenly. Its temperature, its smells, its physical weight. Things that none of those who came for the party saw. The Playboy Mansion was an architecture of power not only because it belonged to a media mogul. It was an architecture of power because it presupposed the existence of a world that must remain hidden. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Beverly Hills Valley was a place where America learned to dream. To the west was the ocean. To the east were movie studios filming myths of freedom, romance, and power. And between them, among the winding roads overgrown with eucalyptus and acacia trees, stood a mansion that became the stage for a new type of cultural elite. The Playboy Mansion was experiencing its golden season, an era when the house ceased to be just a residence and became a national symbol of pleasure, status, and media power. It was during this time that its walls first took on the significance that would later be recorded in the textbooks of American cultural history. But to understand the scale of its peak, one must imagine what America looked like during that era. The country had just gone through some tough decades. The Vietnam War, the political assassinations of the 1960s, the Watergate scandal, the economic crisis of the early 1970s. By 1977, the US was craving a different story, one that was light, bold, and bright. and the Playboy Mansion offered them just that. At that time, social media did not yet exist. People learned about the rich life through magazines, television shows, and rare reports. And the house on Charing Cross Road became the most mythologized venue in the country after the White House and MGM studios. What happened behind its gates instantly became legendary. Guests, recalling those years, said, "At the Playboy Mansion, it didn't matter what was happening. What mattered was that it was happening here." Every evening, the mansion was transformed into a carefully planned theatrical production. Everything, the lighting, the music, the movement of people, was part of the script. Scene 1. Guests arrive at the gate. Security worked just like at a major film studio. Checking the list, verifying invitations, a short pause, and the gate opens slowly, like in a movie, creating the feeling of a transition between worlds. Scene 2. Entering the house. A large hall with oak paneling, stone arches, and soft diffused lighting. Guests felt like they were in an old English manor, but filled with Californian freedom. Scene 3. A journey through the rooms. Each room played its own role. The games room, a symbol of pleasure and eccentricity. The projection room, the center of media power. The library, a space for meetings with writers, directors, and scientists. The grotto and pool, a utopian zone where Hollywood and reality mingled. The house itself was transformed into a sequence of meanings. Each door revealed a new scene in a cultural spectacle. The golden age coincided with the years when Mansion became the informal center of American show, business, and the intellectual elite. Among its guests were old school directors, Billy Wilder, Stanley Kramer, actors from the dawn of television, James Caan, Jack Nicholson, stand-up comedians and satirists such as Richard Pryor and George Carlin, musicians such as Elton John, Kiss, and Fleetwood Mac, moderate political figures who wanted to appear modern. The crowd was diverse but united by one principle. These were the people who shaped the cultural climate of the country. The Playboy Mansion became a place where contracts were signed, projects were launched, and creative conflicts were resolved. Often, entire films, television shows, and magazine issues were conceived right here in the relaxed atmosphere of evening discussions. Guests at the mansion found themselves in a space where the usual social barriers disappeared. Actors sat next to business people. Writers discussed ideas with rock stars. Scientists debated the future of technology with filmmakers, and journalists gathered material from lively conversations. Hefner succeeded in creating a new type of cultural platform, very similar to the salons of the 19th century, but adapted for the age of television. While the Vanderbilts discussed economics in their homes and the Astors discussed European politics in their living rooms, here they discussed the advertising industry, television, freedom of speech, new journalism, the sexual revolution, in an analytical media sense, performance art, and the future of youth culture. It was an intellectual center hidden under the guise of a perpetual party. What seemed easy for guests was a complex operation for the staff. During the celebrations, there were up to 10 chefs, about 20 waiters, a group of technical specialists, lighting technicians, gardeners to monitor the grounds, press visit coordinators, PR and security specialists. Every detail, the timing of the dishes, the temperature in the rooms, the distribution of people throughout the space was calculated in advance. This invisible choreography transformed the mansion into a theater controlled from behind the scenes. In its heyday, the mansion didn't just host guests, it produced content. Reports from the mansion appeared in magazines and on television. The whole world saw the house as a symbol of the American hedonistic dream. But much less was known about its intellectual and social influence. The mansion became a filming location, an informal editorial office, a PR platform, a factory of cultural images, an analog of a private club where media trends were formed. It was during this period that the Playboy Mansion became an exportable symbol. It was known outside the US and written about in Europe, Latin America, Japan, and Australia. The American dream in the 1970s was sold not only through Hollywood, but also through the house that became its microcosm. The Golden Age created the feeling that it would last forever. But any peak is also a moment of greatest fragility. The house shone, the music played, the celebrities laughed, but it was during these years that the structure began to emerge that would lead to crises in the future. The dependence of culture on media images, the widening gap between the elite and society, the growing pressure of the entertainment market, the inevitable aging of a myth built on youth and novelty. The Playboy Mansion became an icon of the era, but its very iconicity already concealed its decline, like marble, which shines brightest just before it begins to crumble. The peak of greatness is rarely perceived as such at the moment it occurs. Guests still gathered in the illuminated halls, the garden was manicured like an 18th century English park, and cameras clicked away with their usual zeal. But beneath the surface, tension was growing, not loud, not visible, but structural. The very crack that spreads quietly, until one day it becomes a whole system of faults. America is beginning to change, and everything around the mansion is changing. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the United States was entering a new era. It was a transitional period between the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and the ultra-pragmatic America of Reagan. Several historical factors struck simultaneously. 1. Economic decline and stagflation. The years 1979 and 1982 were one of the most tense economic periods of the 20th century. Unemployment rose, inflation exceeded 10%, and the dollar lost its strength. The middle class felt unstable and increasingly lost faith in the idea of endless prosperity. The mansion, a symbol of celebration and ease, began to seem anachronistic. What had recently been perceived as style and freedom now looked like excess, an aesthetic that did not correspond to the national mood. 2. The television revolution. The emergence of cable channels and the rise of MTV changed mass culture. Playboy lost its monopoly on visual imagery. America was quickly learning to consume other forms of entertainment. The mansion, which had been the center of media power, now competed with an entire industry. 3. The dawn of the digital age, computers entered homes. Information began to circulate faster. The world did not yet understand that the internet was being born, but it was already clear that the new media era would not depend on physical spaces, even legendary ones like the mansion. Hefner's model of the home as a cultural citadel was losing its relevance. The first crack. The exhaustion of the myth. In the 1970s, Playboy offered a lifestyle that seemed revolutionary. In the 1980s, this image began to turn into a formula, and the formula into a cliché. The magazine lost circulation. The entertainment market became tougher and more aggressive. Younger generations saw Playboy's aesthetic not as a challenge to the system, but as an element of the old system that was losing its freshness. What had once been a symbol of freedom was now perceived as a commercial stylization of a bygone era. When a myth loses its edge, it becomes fragile. The second crack, infrastructure that is becoming too much. The 1927 mansion was not designed to function as an industrial cultural center for decades. Over the years, the pipes aged, the electrical system required constant upgrades, the ventilation needed to be rebuilt, the garden became increasingly difficult to maintain, and the pool and grotto required constant and expensive maintenance. Maintaining the house cost millions a year. During Playboy's era of rapid growth, this went unnoticed. But when the company's revenues began to decline, the mansion became a financial drain. A structure created for celebration proved vulnerable to reality. The economy does not tolerate eternal celebration. The third crack, a shift in cultural perspective. By the mid-1980s, America had entered a period in which society was paying closer attention to the media, power, and representation. The first serious studies of the cultural industry appeared. Playboy, long considered a provocateur, was now increasingly perceived as part of the media elite, and the mansion as a symbol of its privileges. The criticism was not harsh, but it was constant. It undermined the reputation on which the house's influence was based. Crack number 4. System fatigue. The invisible world of the mansion's workers was also undergoing changes. The staff was aging. Shifts were becoming more difficult. The infrastructure required more hands. The house, which once seemed easy to manage, now required an enormous amount of labor. Paradox. The more luxurious the space, the more effort it takes to make it look naturally beautiful. But the fragility of the system was hidden under the idea of celebration. Celebration is a mask, and under the mask is the fatigue of materials, people, and power. Turning point. The crisis of the wealth model. The 1980s became an era of new billionaires, tech moguls, financiers, investors. Their wealth was different. It was built on information. It did not require palaces. It was mobile. It existed in numbers rather than in stone. The mansions of the Gilded Age and the homes of the media moguls of the 1970s seemed like a thing of the past, cumbersome, expensive, and impossible to modernize. The Playboy mansion has become a cultural dinosaur. Beautiful, but cumbersome. Out of place in a world that increasingly values invisibility over ostentation. The Reagan era. New morals, new values. American society swung back toward conservatism. Ideas that seemed radical in the 1960s were now viewed less favorably. Playboy found itself caught between two eras. Too bold for the new conservatism. Too old for the new youth culture. The mansion retained its aura, but that aura no longer matched the era. The cracks are becoming apparent by the end of the 1980s. The last great parties had lost their former scale. Celebrities were coming less often. Its place in the cultural hierarchy had weakened. The mansion was becoming more of a relic than an epicenter. But outwardly, everything remained dazzling. The mansion knew how to hide its cracks. This was one of the most striking paradoxes of its history. A house created for publicity knew how to hide more than it showed. And it was precisely this ability to hide that turned its crisis into a long, quiet, and dangerous process. The greatness of the Playboy mansion rested on three pillars: myth, media power, economic support. By the end of the 1980s, all three pillars began to crumble. The myth became outdated, media power fell apart, and the economy required a rethink. But most importantly, the very ideas of the house as the center of cultural revolution became impossible in the era of digital acceleration. The mansion was not just going through a crisis, it was experiencing the end of its model of the world. What was a perfect mechanism in the 1970s had become obsolete by the 1990s. The celebration continued by inertia, but the truth was already clear. The era for which mansion was built was coming to an end, and the house was preparing to enter the most difficult stage of its life after its own greatness. The mansion survived an era when its owner was not just the owner of the house. He was an ideologist, an architect of a lifestyle, a person whose personality determined the very function of the space. But time always wins. Even the most prominent figures pass away, and houses that outlive their creators enter a new, inevitably unsettling phase, a phase of rethinking. For most large American residences of the 20th century, it was precisely the moment of transfer of control that became the starting point for decline. But the Playboy mansion is an exception. It did not disappear. It was not sold off in pieces. It did not become an office, hotel, or residential complex. It entered an era when its fate was no longer determined by the ambitions of its creator, but by the interests of new structures: corporate, media, legal, and cultural. In the 1980s and 1990s, Hugh Hefner gradually stepped away from the day-to-day management of the company. His eldest daughter, Christy Hefner, became president of Playboy Enterprises in 1988. Her appointment symbolized a new phase. For the first time, Playboy was run not by an iconic figure, but by a manager of the corporate era. During her tenure at Playboy, she cut a number of unprofitable divisions, aggressively entered cable television, and weathered one of the biggest downturns in the printing industry. Under Christie, the mansion remained the heart of the brand, but was no longer its driving force. It was a house archive, a house museum of her father's era, which the company used as cultural capital, but less and less as a business tool. In the 1990s, corporations began rapidly divesting themselves of expensive physical assets. The era of outsourcing, digitization, and optimization began. There were also discussions within Playboy. Was it worth keeping the mansion? Could content production be moved to a studio? How could the house be used to generate profit rather than expense? This gave rise to a model that would determine the fate of the house for the next 20 years. The mansion as a venue for media, events, and licensing of the Playboy atmosphere. The architecture itself became a commodity, an object of commercial exploitation. It was not the walls that had value, but what those walls symbolized. An amazing fact, none of Hefner's children wanted to live in the mansion. The reasons were pragmatic and culturally understandable. The house required enormous expenses. The house was associated with a lifestyle that none of the heirs wanted to continue. The house was too famous to become a private residence. American culture, at the end of the 20th century, valued privacy far more than public luxury. The new elite style, minimalism, gated communities, high-tech villas in California, had nothing in common with the old Los Angeles residences of the Hollywood era. The mansion gradually became a heavy legacy, an object that could not simply be abandoned, but which could not be fully owned. Playboy Enterprises entered a period of turbulence in the 2000s. Magazine sales were falling. The internet was destroying traditional publishing businesses. The company was looking for ways to survive, and the mansion became an asset that needed to be reevaluated. The new managers no longer viewed the mansion as a cultural stronghold, but as a brand resource, a historical object, a platform for licensing the Playboy name. This seriously changed the attitude towards the house. It was no longer private territory. It became a media object, a form of property that could be converted into capital through TV shows, patronage events, and rentals for filming. In the 2000s, the media industry experienced a new boom. Reality shows, cable networks, the emergence of digital platforms. The Playboy Mansion became the perfect object for reinterpretation. Reality projects, documentaries, and exclusive reports appeared. The house became a location rather than a residence. This period saw another important structural shift. The influence of the house no longer depended on its owner. It became a symbol that directors, producers, and marketers worked with. The youth of the 2000s perceived the Playboy Mansion differently, not as the epicenter of freedom, not as an alternative to puritanical society, but as a fragment of pop culture, a kind of museum of the Hollywood era. This generation was as interested in the history of the house as it was in the history of the old MGM studios or Paramount pavilions. The mansion became a cultural object, separated from its former ideological functions. By the end of his life, Hugh Hefner was no longer directly managing the mansion. His role had become ceremonial and symbolic, like that of a patriarch watching over a house that now lived its own life. Historical fact: while still alive, Hefner agreed to a deal that anticipated the transfer of the mansion to a new owner, a unique form of transaction in which the house was sold. But Hefner continued to live in it until the end of his life. Thus, the mansion entered a fateful stage, preparing to transition through an era. Why did the house become such a heavy legacy? The reasons are structural and deeply documentary. Economic: maintenance is too expensive. Legal: the house is associated with the brand, and the brand is associated with corporations. Cultural: the image of Playboy no longer corresponds to modern ethics. Media: the mansion has become a symbol that cannot be sold quietly. Architectural: the house is too famous to be just a house. It has become an object that cannot be privatized and cannot be let go. And therein lies the tragic fate of all the great residences of the 20th century. When a house ceases to belong to a person and begins to belong to history, a conflict arises between the past and the future. The mansion stood on its hill in Holmby Hills, surrounded by old trees and seemed eternal. But beneath this eternity lay something else. The house was preparing for the moment when it would become, for the first time, not someone's dream, but an asset in the hands of new players in the era of digital capitalism. Mansions rarely die suddenly. More often than not, they undergo a slow but inexorable transformation. From a private dream to a public symbol, from a stage for the elite to a business tool, from a living space to a museum exhibit. The Playboy Mansion went through this process faster and more dramatically than most 20th century homes. Its turning point was not architectural but cultural. The world changed, and the house remained the same, and so it became incompatible with the times. In 2016, a year before Hefner's death, a historic turning point occurred. Playboy Enterprises, under pressure from the market and accumulated debt, sold the mansion to a private sector investor, Darren Metropolis, a billionaire and owner of Hostess Brands. The price of the deal, approximately $100 million, was one of the largest in the history of private residence sales in the United States. But there was something much more important than the numbers in this deal. Hefner retained the right to live in the mansion for the rest of his life, and the mansion was sold on the condition that the buyer preserve its exterior appearance, as the estate was under historical protection by the city of Los Angeles. It was a paradoxical deal. The house was sold, but the owner remained. There was a new owner, but the functions of the house remained the same. The public era came to an end, but the symbolic capital of the house continued to grow. In fact, it was the institutionalization of the mansion, transforming it into an object whose significance is determined not by a person, but by a system of expanded interests, investors, cultural critics, the media, and urban structures. After Hefner's death in 2017, large-scale restoration work began on the mansion. Metropolis announced that he intended to restore the house to its original glory, similar to its condition in the 1970s, the heyday of Playboy. Internal reports and restoration documents show that the outdated engineering systems required complete modernization. Lead paint and old utilities needed to be replaced. The 20,000 square meter grounds were worn down by decades of heavy use. The animal enclosures, a reminder of Hefner's 1970s zoo, were dismantled. The garden areas were redesigned and brought into compliance with California's new environmental standards. But that's not all. During the renovation process, the mansion was perceived for the first time as a historical monument that needed to be preserved not for the sake of the Playboy brand, but for the sake of Los Angeles's cultural memory. Such a transformation is rare. Most houses from the media era of the 1960s, 1980s were perceived as temporary symbols rather than cultural artifacts. The Playboy Mansion was an exception. It became an archive of the era of the sexual revolution, media modernism, and Californian counterculture. A house without an owner is a vacuum that needs new meaning. When the mansion lost its creator in 2017, a new question came up. What's the role of a house in the 21st century? It no longer served as a media center, a venue for corporate events, a symbol of modern hedonism, a cultural space sought after by young models and artists of the 1970s, 1990s. But it gained another meaning, a historical one. Public discussions about the mansion became part of a global conversation about the legacy of the 20th century media industry. Like Paramount Studios, the Chateau Marmont hotels, and the residences of people like Walt Disney and Frank Sinatra, the Playboy Mansion became a tangible document of culture. The house seemed to ask, if an era has ended, should the walls remain silent? Or do they have the right to speak for their creators? Metropolis, who bought not only the mansion but also the neighboring house, actually planned to create a single complex covering more than 3 hectares, something like a modern urban citadel. The plans were discussed by city commissions and included the creation of new garden areas, the modernization of the swimming pool, the restoration of the famous grotto, and improvements to security and privacy systems. But more importantly, the discussions did not include returning the mansion to the public space of the Playboy brand. This meant that the mansion would cease to be a media image factory. It would become a private property with historical status. It would go beyond the brand that had defined it for 50 years. In fact, the house was given the chance to become a place of memory rather than a tool of the entertainment industry. Many residences of the 20th century have disappeared, destroyed, rebuilt, lost their significance, turned into hotels or offices. But the Playboy Mansion retains a paradoxical vitality. It has survived. A change in cultural eras, the collapse of the magazine market, the transformation of Playboy Enterprises, a change of ownership, the death of its creator, criticism, and a re-evaluation of the lifestyle of the 1970s. And yet the house remains, not as a symbol of eternal celebration, but as a complex document of an era in which the following were mixed together: economic ambitions, media audacity, architectural eclecticism, social contrasts, and cultural contradictions of late 20th century America. Today, Mansion is still closed to the public, but its significance no longer belongs to its owners. It belongs to architectural historians, media researchers, cultural scholars, urban planners, and anyone who studies the transformation of the American dream. It has become a field for discussion rather than a field for parties. And perhaps this is its new purpose: not to create a beautiful illusion, but to help analyze how illusions were created. Sooner or later, the history of almost every great house enters a territory where legend collides with reality. In the case of the Playboy Mansion, this moment came not because of a single event, but because of a series of waves, legal, social, cultural, media, political, that rolled over the mansion for decades. They did not destroy the walls, but they did destroy the illusion on which the house had stood for half a century. The illusion of unclouded freedom, glamour, and eternal celebration. In the early 2000s, many visitors to the mansion still saw it as a symbol of a bygone era, a place where media history intertwined with the history of Los Angeles elite. But along with this came a layer of suspicion, investigations, lawsuits, and a rethinking of cultural norms. The mansion became a backdrop that was too recognizable, too closely associated with a culture that society now analyzed much more critically than before. The scandals surrounding the Playboy Mansion cannot be viewed as a coincidence. They were part of a larger process, a global rethinking of the media industry at the end of the 20th century. In the 1990s and 2000s, a cultural shift took place. What was once considered the norm for show business and the advertising industry became a cause for public criticism. Media historians note that during this period, many cultural institutions, from music labels to modeling agencies, faced retrospective analysis of their practices. And the Playboy Mansion, as the greatest symbol of male media glamour in the 20th century, found itself at the epicenter of this process. One of the earliest signs was a series of inspections by the Los Angeles Department of Public Health. In 2011, dozens of guests at a large event held on Plantation Drive reported an illness that was later classified as Legionnaire's disease, a form of legionellosis. The inspections revealed a problem in the engineering systems associated with the Grotto Waterfall, one of the mansion's most famous areas. Although the official cause was cited as technical malfunctions rather than negligence, this episode showed the world that the first cracks of reality were appearing beneath the mansion's glossy exterior. Los Angeles health authorities added the mansion to the list of facilities subject to increased scrutiny. It was not a scandal in the classic media sense, but it became an important turning point. For the first time, the mansion made headlines not as a symbol of luxury, but as a target for inspections. In the second half of the 2010s, the cultural landscape changed dramatically. Documentary books, interviews, podcasts, and biographical materials were published in which former guests of the mansion, actors, models, entertainment industry employees, described the atmosphere of the mansion as a complex combination of glamour, secrecy, media pressure, and unequal power relations. Important. In our documentary style, we do not describe intimate details, only the historical context and cultural processes. This stage gave researchers the chance to view the mansion not as a place of parties, but as a complex social institution where the following were intertwined: the power of the media over human destinies, the role of corporate brands in shaping cultural norms, the influence of celebrity on social relations, and inequality of opportunity within the industry. It was during this period that the mansion ceased to be an object of frivolous admiration and became the subject of socio-critical analysis. By this time, Playboy Enterprises was already facing serious structural challenges: declining revenues from the print business, the transition of its audience to the digital space, increasing competition, pressure from investors, and the search for a new business model. Since the early 2000s, the company had been regularly selling assets, closing divisions, and restructuring licenses. The mansion became part of this economic drama. It was expensive to maintain, and the brand no longer met new moral and cultural requirements. It is in this zone, at the intersection of financial crisis, audience shifts, and cultural pressure, that the mansion becomes not just a home, but a center for the struggle to interpret the past. Mediascape: how journalism turned a house into a symbol of an era. After Hefner's death in 2017, a new wave of interest in the history of the mansion began. Journalists from The New York Times, LA Weekly, The Guardian, Vice, and a number of other publications published historical studies analyzing the corporate structure of Playboy Enterprises, the role of the mansion in the Los Angeles media ecosystem, the mansion's connection to the celebrity culture of the 1970s, 1990s, and the inner workings of an industry built around the image of youth, beauty, and glamour. Many experts considered the Playboy Mansion to be a unique document of the era, which helped to understand how standards of attractiveness were formed, how brands influenced the entertainment industry, how norms of behavior in Hollywood changed, how a system was created in which media power became an instrument of social domination. Thus, the mansion transformed from a private residence into a public symbol of the phenomenology of power in 20th century culture. The dark chapter of mansion lies not in individual events, but in their overall nature. The mansion became a point where cultural expectations and cultural reality came into conflict. It reflected the ambitions of its creator, a generation's dream of freedom, the achievements and contradictions of the media industry, a value system that no longer coincided with contemporary morality, and troubling questions about power and dependence in the entertainment business. Its walls became witnesses not to crimes, but to a cultural evolution in which society asks difficult but important questions about the past. The mansion scandal is not a drama about one person, but a drama about a civilization that is rethinking its ideals, values, and mechanisms of power. The Playboy Mansion is one of those rare houses that transcend architecture and become symbols, not metaphors or legends, but mirrors in which eras see themselves as they are, with the glare of achievements, but also with the shadows of contradictions. To understand the mansion, one must see not only its walls, but also the society reflected in them, striving for freedom, wealth, status, and recognition, while constantly experiencing anxiety about the possible consequences of its own progress. The mansion on Charing Cross Road is not just the residence of a media mogul. It is an analytical plane through which one can study the transformations of American society from the late 1950s to the present day. Its history is the history of media, engineering, labor, business, cultural power, urban politics, and the complex processes that accompanied the second half of the 20th century. The sexual revolution, the rise of Hollywood, the attention economy, the commercialization of beauty, and the myth of endless freedom. In the 1960s, 1980s, the Playboy Mansion became the material expression of a new ideology: the ideology of consumer freedom, individual enjoyment of life, the optimism of the technological age, and the belief that a beautiful image can be the path to success. Cultural historians note that the mansion became a symbol of the post-war prosperity era, It was a time of the growth of the middle class, the expansion of university education, the emergence of mass advertising, and the heyday of magazine corporations. Against the backdrop of the American economic miracle, the mansion became something of a utopia, a promise of a world where work, creativity, media, and pleasure merged into a continuous modern life. But this utopia did not exist on its own. It reflected the ideology of consumption that spread through television, magazines, mass fashion, and the influence of Hollywood. The Playboy Mansion became an architectural monument to this ideology. However, any mirror reflects not only light, but also shadows. Economic studies from the late 20th century show that while California's elites were consolidating their influence, the gap between the rich and the middle class was gradually widening. The mansion, like many elite residences of the time, was a place where status determined access, access determined opportunities, opportunities determined careers and the outcomes of human lives. It was a hub of power, an unofficial institution where the following intersected: media corporations, advertising agencies, production centers, Hollywood studios, and local political circles in Los Angeles. This is why cultural critics refer to the Playboy Mansion not as a house, but as a social apparatus, a mechanism that distributes attention or resources and status within the entertainment industry. The city as context. Mansion and Los Angeles. It is impossible to imagine the mansion outside its urban environment. Los Angeles is a city built around the dream industry, the visual image industry, the attractiveness industry. In the 1960s, 1990s, California was the epicenter of cultural globalization, and the Playboy Mansion became one of the most recognizable addresses of this process. But the city did not live on glamour alone. At the same time, there was growing poverty in South Los Angeles, a widening gap between the wealthy Bel Air elite and the working class neighborhoods, the expansion of the suburbs at the expense of cheap migrant labor, and transportation and environmental crises. Mansion was at the heart of this paradox, a dream city built on real inequality. Like any symbol, it unwittingly emphasized this gap, even when its creators had no intention of demonstrating it. The Playboy Mansion functioned as a complex infrastructure system, where dozens of people worked daily to ensure the smooth operation of this enormous property. Historical documents, staff interviews, and materials from city archives show that the house required round-the-clock work by technicians, gardeners, cooks, drivers, security specialists, and workers to maintain the historic interior elements. This labor was invisible, and that is precisely why it is so important for understanding the mansion as a social mirror. Like all of 20th century America, the house built its legend on the idea of ease and luxury, but it was sustained by physical labor, low-paying jobs, long shifts, work hidden from privileged guests. Economists call such structures a two-tiered capitalism model. The upper tier is those who use the space. The lower tier is those who create the space. Mansion was one of the most striking architectural metaphors for this model. The Playboy Mansion became a media sensation even before it was commonplace. Photo shoots, interviews, documentary footage, and television shows of the 1990s made it part of the American television landscape. Every hall, every room, every backdrop in the mansion was taken out of its private space and turned into a screen image. Thus, the house became a content-producing space, an advertising tool, an element of commercial myth, an object that existed both physically and virtually. Sources indicate that in the 1990s, 2010s, Mansion could appear on screen up to 200 times a year in a wide variety of media formats. It was a phenomenon that cultural studies scholars call architecture as media, a house that became content. When the wave of social movements in the 2010s raised questions about power, access, gender politics, and cultural production, Mansion was reworked not as a place of entertainment, but as a historical source that needed to be analyzed. It became a kind of museum object unofficially but inevitably. Researchers emphasize, Mansion helps us understand. what Hollywood was like behind the scenes, how the beauty industry influenced social roles, what emotional, economic, and symbolic forces shaped the era, how the boundaries of what was acceptable in culture were defined, why ideas about freedom took different forms in different years. The Playboy Mansion is not just a house, it is an archive of American dreams and illusions captured within its walls. The significance of the Playboy Mansion today lies not in what happened in its rooms, but in what society saw of itself in it. It shows how we build myths, how we hide labor, how we worship success, how we justify luxury, how we avoid uncomfortable questions, how we use architecture to demonstrate power, how eras rewrite the past when values change. The estate became a mirror reflecting the America of the golden age of magazines, the America of Hollywood, the America of inequality, the America of capitalist paradoxes, the America of advertising illusions, the America of cultural upheavals. The Playboy Mansion was no exception. It was a symptom, and therein lies its documentary, historical, and philosophical significance. Today, the house is a private residence that has undergone extensive renovation. The new owners are carefully preserving the architecture, but erasing traces of the media mogul era. The thread of time is also palpable. Earthquakes, rising maintenance costs, aging communications, cultural changes that make the old legend less understandable to younger generations. The Playboy Mansion has become a symbol of a bygone era in which private homes were centers of cultural power. Today, power has shifted to the internet, to digital platforms, to algorithms. The mansion seems to ask the question, what will happen to the homes of power when power becomes virtual? At dusk, the mansion seems almost peaceful. The wind rustles the treetops, and the old stone retains the warmth of the passing day. But if you listen closely, the house seems to say, I was a stage. I was a myth. I was a reflection of your era. And now, I am your lesson. Every house has its shadow. Every era has its blind spots. Every legend has a price paid by those who remain outside the frame. The last image. The closing door of the library. A ray of light falling on the dusty pages of an album. And the silence of a house that knows more about its era than people are willing to admit. What do we choose to remember? What do we forget? And what will we repeat again if we don't learn to look honestly?